you've ever felt like you're wearing a mask in your business, showing up as who you think a consultant should be rather than your authentic self, today's episode is going to resonate deeply. I'm talking with Anthony Calleo, a leadership consultant and certified Reset It specialist who spent 30 years climbing the corporate ladder before making the leap to independent consulting. I'm AJ Riedel. This is the Thriving Through podcast, where each week I have real conversations with self-employed consultants about what it really takes to build a profitable consulting practice. Now back to Anthony. What makes Anthony's story so compelling isn't just his successful transition from corporate executive to thriving consultant. It's how he discovered his biggest obstacle wasn't competition, pricing, or even finding clients. It was imposter syndrome and fear-based decision making that kept him from operating as his authentic self. In our conversation, Anthony opens up about the moment he realized he was attracting the wrong clients because he was presenting as a character of who he thought a consultant should be rather than being himself. He shares the physical signs he learned to recognize when he's operating from old programming versus authentic presence, and how this awareness transformed not only his business, but his entire approach to networking, sales conversations, and client relationships. Whether you're just starting your consulting journey or you've been at it for years, but still struggle with that nagging feeling that you don't quite belong in the room, Anthony's insights about shedding the plaster that life covers us up with to reveal the golden Buddha within will give you a completely new perspective on building an authentic, profitable, and fulfilling consulting practice. Let's dive in. Welcome, Anthony Calleo, to the Thriving Through podcast. I'm so delighted to have you as my guest today.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, AJ. I've very much been looking forward to this.
Me too. I have a couple questions that I ask all of my podcast guests. What was your path to becoming a self-employed consultant?
It was a long, windy path, for sure. And just a little quick explanation to that. Had about 30 years in corporate in various roles, and always had this path in the back of my mind. I kind of always saw it. To make a very long story short, I just didn't have the bravery and maturity to pursue that path at the time for a whole myriad of reasons, which I would love to get into because I think that story is helpful. Um, but with time comes some wisdom, and I decided, quite frankly, to make a long story short, is I was not going to lean into my fears, and I was just going to lean into what's possible. And I decided to go down this path of being self-employed much later on in my career, right? So I dipped my toe into it as setting it up as sort of a side hustle. And
Mhm.
then about a year and a half ago, left from what I firmly believe is my last corporate role to kind of just go full time into this effort because I really think it requires that much energy and attention to kind of bring it to life.
So, what was that sort of defining moment when you were working at it as a side hustle? When you said, "This is it. I'm
You
I'm
know,
gonna I'm gonna quit my
yeah, it was
job."
Yeah, it was defining moments, not moment. And it was sort of like
Okay.
building up, and I believe, and I think based on prior conversations that you and I have, we believe that the more you open yourself up, the more possibility flows in, right? And I mean that in a psychological sense. I mean it in a spiritual sense, a quantum physics sense. And so it was a slow cracking open of the door of various people who were already in my life who were softly encouraging me to go down this path. And then as I went down the path slowly, new people started coming into my life, and that continues to be the case to this day, including, our relationship, AJ, quite frankly. I don't think it's an accident that we're here talking to one another.
Yep.
And so it wasn't a moment, it was a series of moments that sort of got me to where I am today. And it's a complete in I am not a big believer in regret, and you take what you've learned and you moved on. And if I look back on it fairly, I believe that I now only have the maturity and growth to go on the path that I'm on now, right? And I tell everybody, AJ, I'm a very slow learner. There are some folks that, I've spoken to even recently that have come to that, realization very much earlier in life. But to me, it just took me a little bit of time. And then quite frankly, as I mentioned before, letting go of some of that fear, which, really was just a set of programs and conditions that were handed down to me by the various people that were in my lives.
Right. Yeah, I'm a slow learner too when it comes to, well, actually not my consulting business, but since then. But it's not being a slow learner, it's that the wealth of knowledge that you had from all of your corporate time and all of your life experiences has made you that much better as a consultant and coach.
Extremely well said, AJ. Yeah, that's exactly right. And at any point that happens in your life, it's a wonderful thing, right? And I will never take away from the relationships I built with the people I met in corporate. I mean, I've got some lifelong friends and colleagues that I'm still in touch with, and I could certainly say I'm a better off. I'm ready to be in this role that I'm in now, and I'm certainly a person better off and knowing all of them. So I wouldn't trade, I wouldn't give away any of that.
Right. You talked a little bit about fear, so I think this is, I'm kind of setting you up to talk about your fear-based decision making here. What has been the hardest thing you've been through, and how did you overcome it?
I think it's, getting through that, going through those impossibility walls that we put up for ourselves, and that, quite frankly, that negative, self-talk, and that doubt that always comes in our head when we want to try something. A lot of it had to do with the trappings of, um, how comfortable I got in corporate. And again, this is not a corporate bashing, segment by any. I had a wonderful career in corporate. Corporate has served a lot of people well. It was just a very late realization to me that I was more of a solopreneur, and somebody that needed to be out there sort of advocating what I do and offering what I can offer to a much broader audience on sort of on my terms. To get to that point, I had to get through the fear, and that's and the biggest fear, quite frankly, which I don't know, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, but I do put it in that fear category, is getting over imposter syndrome, right? And that played a big role in my corporate career, quite frankly, which is all
Mhm.
part of those masks that we wear, right? And so it's about showing up as who I think, whoever I'm working for or whatever relationship I'm in, showing up as that person as opposed to my true authentic self. And I think that is, I don't want to call it fear-based, but I think that's all under the, fear umbrella.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Because, I mean, imposter syndrome is feeling like you don't belong in the room,
Right.
that it was a fluke and they're going to
Right.
find you out, some that you're going to say something and suddenly they're going to say, oh my God, this, this guy really, it's very real. And it, yeah, it's a big thing. So thank you for sharing that. So, tell us a story or two about the biggest challenges you faced building your practice and how you've overcome them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I got to tell you, because of that path that I took and how I got here, I think I only had really one big challenge because, again, I think life was preparing me for this moment.
Mhm.
But at the point in which I made the decision to kind of go out fully on my own, a opportunity presented itself, which I seized upon immediately. And upon reflecting on that, I look at it now, and it was very much the decision to get involved in that project was very much fear-based, right? And it really wasn't any different than I decided, you know what, I should just take another full-time corporate role. And so I leaned into the fear, and into my fear again, which, we've got to give ourselves some grace on that. I mean, it's not unlike burnout. Like burnout can take us years to get burnt out. But once
Mhm.
we've burnt out, even supposedly after we recover, to get burnt out again, it's a much shorter fuse, right? And so to jump right back into feeling those fears and that self-doubt and sort of not having an abundance mindset, more of a scarcity mindset of, okay, I'm out on my own. Where's my income going to come from? Yeah, I made a not such great decision, right? And so that's probably the biggest hurdle that I've had to overcome. But I've just have, again, as I said before, I have just a wonderful set of people in my life who's just incredibly supportive, including family, right? And so inside and outside of family. And so it's I think when you operate, I take that back. I know when you operate from a state of presence, there is no right or wrong, right? You're just on the path that you need to be because you're operating from a state of presence. And so that's, with the exception of that one moment where I kind of slid back a little bit, I haven't had any of these, oh my God, what am I doing moments.
Mhm. How do you now, looking back, you can look back and you can say, okay, those decisions were fear-based. How do you distinguish between fear-based decisions and legitimate business caution?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think it all comes from being in a state of presence, right? And I define that, by the way, for you and everybody as being absent of your programs and conditions, right? And so we're all or many of us are a product of our programs and conditions, right? And they were handed to us from teachers, from society, from parents, and not out of a malicious manipulation, right? It's they were running their programs, they were doing what they knew, and so if you could move those programs and conditions aside and just be present, then it's just you and you're making decisions, and you're putting out into the quantum energy field and getting back what you need to receive. And so I really think it's that simple. And once I feel like a little bit of fear, or for me, if I feel like I'm being triggered, which for me is a physical sensation of in my shoulders and my neck, when I
Hmm.
feel that feeling, I know up. I'm in my programs and conditions, right? And so there's a little bit of a practice that I have to get me back into my present self, and then my decisions will flow from there.
Okay. Give me an example of a program and condition. Help us sort of dimensionalize that.
Um, that's a really good one. I'd like to think I shedded them all, so I don't know them any. I don't know them anymore. But I think a programming condition for me would be, um, you know, uh, this character, having a character of what a consultant should be, right? And this figure. I see this a lot with like startup founders, where they've got this, beautiful idea, this beautiful product. But when I see them present themselves, they're presenting themselves as a character of who they have been taught a startup founder should or shouldn't be, rather than being their authentic selves. And it's the same thing, I think, in my case. So it's, for example, I put myself out there almost daily on LinkedIn, and I do not in the early days I would be, okay, what does the audience want to hear and what might or might not land, and that I found was where I got the lowest amount or no engagement. When I start
Hmm.
going from my state of presence and saying, hey, listen, this is really what's on my mind. I'm putting myself out there as my authentic self, and it either resonates or it doesn't. But the fact of the matter is, it's going to resonate with the right people. And with the people that it in the audience that it doesn't resonate with, they're not my audience, which is, again, not being dismissive. That's fine. They're just not my tribe, not the people that I should be aligning with.
That's a really important point, is that when we are wearing that mask, we're attracting people that are not our ideal client. And one of the things I think it's important for us to get comfortable with is that we have an ideal client that is going to be attracted to us. So everybody else, they don't matter. Just let them go. They're like you said, they're not your tribe. That is a really important thing to learn.
And I find to yeah, yes, and I find that it can go back to that fear thing of, oh my God, if I'm not all things to all people, I'm going to lose a sale, and how am I going to get sales, and how am I going to make money? And you get into that scarcity mindset again. Again, that's another example, quite frankly, of leaning back into the fear, where that voice starts popping up to say, hey, listen, man, you better not narrow yourself, right? That's what we start telling ourselves, like, but you're not narrowing yourself. You're attracting who you need to attract because there's two aspects to that. One is if you add on what you and I are talking about and you're a people pleaser, that can get you in a whole lot of, a difficulty. But
Yeah,
at the end of the day, even if you are attracting those other clients, the amount of friction that you're going to have to end up managing, right, is not worth it. It's just not worth it. And you find yourself in the middle of a difficult engagement or a difficult contract or a difficult conversation because quite frankly, it's not that there's anything wrong with those people. They're not the right people for you. They're not aligned. I would argue that they're stuck in their programs and conditions. And again, I don't mean that in this disparaging way because it's just how they operate, and a lot of people operate that way. But yeah, it's about attracting the right people. And if you start fearing am I going to attract the right people, that's when you're back into that, again, that fear-based model, and that's not going to serve you well.
it's a certain confidence and trust that whatever your intuition, your intellect has told you is your target market or your ideal client, or whatever research you've done, just trust that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to
Yeah.
talk. You've used this word a lot, and I want to kind of to dig into it a little bit more. Authentic, your authentic self. What exactly does that mean?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, it's just really being comfortable with yourself, loving yourself, right? It's the old, make sure you adjust your oxygen mask, right? As they tell us on airplanes before you go to a loved one, because you got to make sure you're all right, right? You got to make sure
Hmm.
you're centered, you're present. And that allows you to not only attract who you need to attract in relationships and business, it just allows you to be a lot more comfortable with, with who you are, right? And that's where the authenticity. I mean, even like, I- you know, I use words like authenticity because it's a label that people understand, but at the end of the day, it's still a label. You don't even need authenticity. You just need to be yourself, right? But I mean, we do need to put labels on these things so we can sort of describe the concepts of what they are. But it's just about loving yourself, being comfortable in your own skin, and that'll emulate and that'll attract what you need to attract.
Right. What comes to mind for me as you're saying that is we in a lot of ways we have to chip away the exterior, the layers. Like there's a story that I love. Have you ever heard the story of the Golden Buddha?
No, I don't believe I have. No.
Well, in Tibet, when the Chinese army invaded Tibet and they were marching through the country and they were decimating the temples. The temple in the main city, the main temple, the monks all worried because they had this huge golden Buddha and it was too big to move, so they couldn't take it away and hide it somewhere. So they covered it with plaster. But then the army came through and killed all the monks. So there was no memory. No one knew that this plaster statue actually was solid gold underneath. So hundreds of years later, they were trying to move it. This what they thought was a plaster Buddha. They were trying to move it to the new temple, and they cracked it. So when they went to repair it, they found out that there was this treasure, incredible priceless treasure underneath. And I love that story because that's sort of what our journey is in life, is that life puts covers us up with a plaster, and our job is to chip it away. So when the golden Buddha that's within all of us is showing through, that's when we're our authentic self.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely beautiful. And and what I would say is, it's letting go of things that don't belong to us, right? These were things that were passed down with. I think I think the stat is we have anywhere from 60 to 70,000 thoughts a day, right? And uh, of those thoughts, only 5% are new thoughts. So we spend most of the time ruminating and being stuck in that, just repeating those stories and things that we believe. And if those stories aren't mostly good stories, we're doing a huge disservice and a lot of damage to ourselves. And we carry that in our relationships with everybody else then, right? So
Right.
yeah, I love that story of I love the story of the golden Buddha. It's another version of the mask wearing, right? Or shielding it. So you got to just, shed that plaster and, as you say, let your golden Buddha shine.
How have you shed your plaster?
Again, it's kind of the same thing with my journey of how I got here. It was this evolutionary process, right? It's this, starting off very early on in my career of wearing a very thick plaster because I had this character of what I thought I needed to be to my employer and to my family. And just over time, through again, the various people who have come into my lives and being open up to it. And some of those people, I mean, one of the most beautiful stories I love to share is, one of the people that really was a catalyst in me changing my thinking was my oldest son, right? And, typically it's like, well, parents teaching their kid and they're mentoring their child and they're raising a child, but, his sense of awareness and quite honestly, some of his youthful challenges of the way the world is, right? Was one spark for me, right? Looking at that and learning from that. And then just all, like I said, all these other people coming into my life where slowly but surely, I got to a point where I was like, wait a minute, there's another different way to do this. And I will say, and actually this just popped in my head, I actually had a very good friend who was going through a coaching certification. And so she needed somebody to work with. And so I volunteered. I said, "Hey, great, free coaching. I get to work with somebody I love." And together we actually tackled my imposter syndrome, which I had really no idea. I didn't have a full appreciation of what it was and where it was coming from. And I would
Mhm.
say that that also was a big catalyst for me now going on the journey. But again, it wasn't like one thing, it wasn't one conversation. It was this, what I call a spiraling up, right? You could spiral down, you can spiral up. It was a spiraling up of different people that come into my life. And I know I use that phrase a lot, but I find that again, the more I do this deep work, the more I draw people into my life who are like, oh, wow, I just had this conversation with AJ and she just gave me this other perspective that I didn't even think about. And again, the door opens a little wider, and that just keeps happening.
If you're open to it.
If you're absolutely
Yeah.
100%, if you're open to it, right. Yes.
Yeah. We talked about when we met earlier, we talked about networking and how what, well, and we talked also about sales conversations. And what do you call sales conversations? You have a term for it.
I mean, one would argue it's a consultative sales approach, right? But it really is, it comes down to listening and being heard, right? So it's like listening to the person that that you're speaking to. And if they have a set of problems or challenges or opportunities that you can solve, and when I mean you could solve it, not a product that you can ram or a service that you can ram down their throats, like, wow, I have the solution for what this person's looking for, then you can make the sale, right? But for me, whether it's sales or networking, it always comes down to intentionality, right? If you're like,
Hmm.
hey, you know what? Before I sell anything to AJ, I want to know who she is as a person, right? I want to get to know as much as AJ's comfortable or the persons you're comfortable sharing with. I want to get to know them as a person and then learn about some of their challenges and opportunities that they have, right? I think if you take that approach as opposed to I have a number to meet or I have to sell this thing, right? And that's where like sales quotas and targets can really become problematic. And again, not that those aren't important for measuring business performance, but those are the results of doing all the intentional work you're doing, right? If you do all that intentional work, all that other stuff takes care of itself, right? And so for me, it's more of having a consultative approach of really understanding what the person wants and not, again, working out of my only goal out of this conversation is to leave AJ buying something from me. If that's my only motivation, I'm putting that out there in the quantum field and I'm going to repel you every time, right? It's going to be a tough sell. Or even if I make this sell, it's going to have all that friction I talked about, which is, working with clients you shouldn't be working with.
Exactly. Yes. So when you do networking with intention.
Yeah.
How,
Yeah.
how do you structure a networking with intention conversation?
Well, and it came out of a realization of many years ago when I went through a reduction in force, right? I was like, I desperately felt like I needed a job, right? And so it's that, scarcity mindset. And
Hmm.
so every networking conversation I had, if it was with you, AJ, it would be like, does AJ have a job for me? Is this going to lead to a job? And I realized not only is that not fair for the person, it's not fair for me, right? And once I put that aside, it was like, hey, I just want to get to know, an interesting person. And if there's an opportunity there and let it organically grow, that's what we need to do. So for me, it's a the first intention is just making a human connection, meeting somebody interesting, leaving each other a little bit better at the end of the conversation. And sometimes you give a little bit more than you get, which is fine. And then from there, if there's an opportunity to organically do business together, great. If not, you left each other a little bit better, right? So maybe it's a piece of wisdom, maybe it's advice, maybe it's some constructive criticism, whatever it is. So for me, it's not going into a conversation being strictly transactional, right? I'm going to try to pitch this and hopefully get back that. Once you remove the transactional part of it and it's just a conversation and you're showing up your true, yeah, your present self, the conversation is going to flow a lot easier. And it could be that if you don't close a deal at that moment, people who use this approach tell me 6 months, 2 years, even 2 years down the line, they'll remember, you know what? I had this conversation with Anthony. I now have this need. Let me go reach back out to him, right? So you're
Hmm.
just setting that, you're setting those really good intentions of, listen, I'm curious about you and what your challenges and opportunities are. And if there's a way for us to partner, right, to address those, great. If not, maybe I know somebody. Maybe I could refer you to AJ, right? Or I could refer you to somebody else I know. So again, it's that going in there and not having this transactional mindset of I got to get something out of this conversation, other than just the human connection.
Right. Just the satisfaction of having met a new person.
100%. Exactly.
We talked about when I introduced myself initially, I talked about the revenue roller coaster. And you nodded and you mentioned that lead development's the number one issue that you hear in your networking groups. What patterns do you see in how consultants sabotage themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think it has really a lot to do with going out there and trying to copy somebody else's model. Now, that's not to say that there aren't good sales coaches out there and lead generation strategies, but when you spend an inordinate amount of time, trying to focus on somebody else's lead generation, because, in the age of social media, there's probably not as much there as that as that person's purporting. But again,
Mhm.
it comes down to, and it comes back to me of like, again, being in your present self and saying, okay, what's right for me? And then all those things that we just talked about not having that, scarcity mindset, because that's when you think you're on that down curve, that's when the desperation starts setting in, right? And that's well, maybe I'll be a little less choosy. And quite honestly, that also goes the same for career choice too, where it's like you begin to, maybe you're out in that market for a little while and you begin to worry about where's my next paycheck going to come from, which is not an unrealistic worry per se. But when you wind up making decisions, out of scarcity rather than out more of an abundance mindset. So for me, it's what you'll find, and here's the irony too. If you shed yourself of all of that and you don't have those, you're not telling those stories like, where's my next sale going to come from? And man, I'm on a down cycle. Once you shed yourself from that and you're operating from a state of presence, the sales start flowing. It just happens, and you don't end up having that situation where I don't have sales, because you're attracting and aligning with the people you need to align with when you need to align with them, right? And that might sound like a mouthful, but again, it's all about, going from, operating from a state of presence, because it's that, and I think it's a lot of like lead generation is no one ever, thought to, oh, I've got to go through this formal program to know how to do it. No, you'll know how to do it if you're operating from a state of presence.
Okay. The what tell me you aligned or you signed up for or became certified in Reset It, something called Reset It.
Yeah, it's a reset it specialist, and essentially what we do is kind of what I've mentioned several times throughout our conversation here, is what we have you help you do is shed the things that don't belong to you and get out of your programs and conditions. So it's a methodology that allows you to reset. So you get rid of those programs and conditions, and then it's just you. And then we've got this whole ecosystem behind it. So it's basically two 90-minute sessions that help you reset it. And then there's this supportive ecosystem behind it. And it's, it really is a beautiful program. And in order to participate as a specialist, we need to reset it ourselves, right? Because if not, I'm just passing my programs and conditions on to my clients, right? So one of the
Yep.
beautiful things about the program is we practice what we preach. And anytime that we feel like we're getting locked into our programs and conditions, like I said before, shoulders get tight, neck gets a little tight, then I know, okay, I need to reset it. And that'll sometimes happen during a client engagement too, where we'll break off the engagement, reset ourselves, and come back in. But it all is really centered around that. And I got to tell you, AJ, that program came into my life through a friend who built the program. Um, Again, no accident that that program came to me, because it really spoke to me, and I knew it was something that I needed to add into my practice, because any type of cultural change really requires leadership to be fully present, right? And not
Hmm.
not have leaders show up with their masks on, right? And that's how true cultural change, true employee experience can execute. So yeah, that the reset program really spoke to me, and it continues to.
Is it something that you require new clients that you take them through before you work with them, or how does it fit in with what you do on a from a consulting standpoint?
It's usually a mix. I mean, it could be just a standalone, like, hey, I'm an individual contributor, I'm a leader that just wants to do some work, or as part of a cultural employee experience engagement, it would be a really early understanding with the leadership team of like, look, you all have to be bought in here, and that leadership team can be an owner or it could be the C-suite. You all have to be fully bought in, and you all have to be fully present in order for this to work, right?
Mhm.
Otherwise, you're just going to be not only trying to implement what I'm trying to teach, but you're also going to be dealing with the friction of having people inside your organization that doesn't think this is the right path to go on, right? So it's bringing everybody in and making sure that as we're building this culture, we're not doing it from our programs and conditions, right? Because otherwise, we all show up to this work location with all our baggage, right? And then we're trying to deal with one another when we're not in a state of presence. So it really is a crucial element. So if I see that there's a lot of mask wearing and there's a lot of friction, that's when I'll recommend that, look, we need to reset it as a team, including myself, before we could start doing the work that we need to do.
Can you tell by looking at a client if they are not present?
You really can. I was just telling a story, and I kind of alluded to it before, but I do a lot of work in thought leadership in the startup community here in New York. And I was at a recent networking event, and I can see founder after founder getting up there and talking about their businesses. And they were really talking from as I mentioned before, from this character of who they thought a startup founder needs to be, maybe based on a book they read, and maybe some of the networking groups they were in, and they weren't really operating from a state of presence. And again, I'm not suggesting any type of intent to defraud. It's just
Hmm.
that's the mask that they were wearing. And so what I find incredible is when you're operating from a state of presence, how much you can immediately recognize when somebody's not. And I'll give you another quick, way non-business story, but my wife unfortunately had a cousin who passed fairly recently, and we were at the wake and at the service, and I just saw a whole his entire family was really mourning based on what they felt like mourning should look like, right? They weren't really in a state of presence. And
Hmm.
so, and it just seemed like they were not only carrying the burden of, in this case, a father or an uncle or a brother who passed, but also carrying the burden of thinking this is how I need to act in a social setting. And so it really, it blew my mind because I never saw in that particular setting through my lens of state of presence, anything like that. So you'll find that when you're operating in a state of presence, you can automatically recognize it, right? And what you do is you try to receive that, you try not to take on that programming, and then you try not to get triggered because otherwise I'm just reflecting my programming back to them.
Right. So you said you could tell with shoulders. What are some other ways that you know for yourself that you are not in present moment?
It's typically for me, it's literally the physical feeling of my shoulders and neck tensing up. That's usually a trigger for me. And then there's also this, I don't know how else to say it, but the sense of that something's off or something's not quite right with that person. Now, the challenge is not to fall into your programs and beliefs, or like I got to somehow try to fix this person, right? They've got to
Mhm.
be ready to, as you well know, AJ, they've got to be ready to receive it, right? And like you mentioned before, you've got to be open to to the possibility. And I think, some of us can fall into that mistake of trying to fix somebody, and it's particularly more powerful as a family member too, because you want to try to heal them and put them in a better place. But you've got to really be careful for that. So for me, it really is the neck, the shoulders, and I've had that, I think, probably all my life, and only realized it fairly recently that that was my trigger.
What would this is kind of a couple of wrap-up questions as we near the end of our podcast today. What would you tell yourself 3 years ago when you decided to make the leap into at least a side hustle? Knowing what you know now, what would you tell that you about building a consulting practice?
Oh man, I would just tell myself, have some more grace and be easier on yourself, and it just approach yourself with a little bit more grace.
Love it. Love it. And now I have a couple rapid fire wrap-up questions. Say that 5 times fast.
Love it.
What's one book, podcast, or resource that's been invaluable in your consulting practice?
Oh man, well, I'm going to give you a book because you asked for a book, but I have a couple. But The Four Agreements was just very, very impactful for me, and I try to live those. I try to live those every day.
Okay, so the four agreements. Great.
Yeah.
Uh, what about business books? Any business books that come
Business
to mind?
books, I mean, Creativity Inc. By Ed Catmull, which is actually over my shoulder. I think that was, a very telling book when it comes to, managing, managing people and creatives and just his approach to business. I will tell you, and again, I know you only asked for one, a arguably a non-business book, but I think it has sweeping business implications is Five Regrets of the Dying, which just
Mm,
is just absolutely amazing. And yeah, it's very appropriate for our conversation here today, AJ. You won't be surprised to learn that the number one regret is at the time of death, the number one regret is not being your authentic self.
wow. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It strikes me that, well, at least this is my feeling, is that we don't always know who our authentic self is, but we know that we're not.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. So another rapid fire question. What's one thing you wish you'd known before starting your practice?
One thing I wish I'd known before starting my practice. You don't need to have it all figured out.
Oh, yeah.
You just don't need that the website and the business card. I mean, all the things that you can pile on, you just don't need to have it all figured out.
Very good advice. Yeah, and that because in a lot of times that stops people from actually getting going because they say, I've got to have this and I've got to have that and I've got to have that, and they don't get started at all.
Right.
What's next for your business?
It's to keep, again, keep building from a place of authenticity, right? It's, practicing what I preached and we talked about is, attracting the people who want to work with me, who are aligned with me, doing a lot of good with the Reset It program and helping a lot of people out there. So that's very purpose driven for me. So it's just keep, continuing to do what I do. And and really just following that last piece of advice I have is not thinking that I have it all figured out, right? And so it's just, it really truly is. And, at the risk of, what somebody might call a little woo-woo, when you're working from a state of presence, you just know you're on the right path, even though you don't know, and you have a certain, somewhat of an idea of your destination, but certainly not an idea of exactly how you're going to get there.
And that's okay.
And that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're trained to feel like we need to program our mental GPS and know exactly how to get there. But then you kind of miss you're heading down the highway and there's the Ball of Twine Museum, and you sort of say, well, that would be interesting. I'd like to go see the Ball of Twine Museum. And it takes you off the your destination for a little while, but it was worth it.
I love that. Yeah, yeah, it's funny. As soon as you said that, AJ, I thought like just, have the grace to know that when you hear the words recalculating, you're like, that's okay. It's okay because that means it's going to get you to where you need to go, just in a different way.
Yes. So relax and don't freak out when you took the wrong turn and your GPS system is recalculating.
Exactly.
And now this is the last most important question. How can listeners connect with you if they want to learn more about what you do?
LinkedIn is the best place to go. It'll direct
Okay.
you to everywhere else. And again, I'm interested in thought leadership and authentic conversations, following that philosophy that we talked about throughout this call. So, follow, reach out to connect, and, I'd love to have a conversation with folks.
Okay, wonderful. And I will put the your LinkedIn URL in the show notes so people can go and click right on that and get get connected with you. So,
Fantastic.
Anthony, thank you so much for being my guest today. I really enjoyed our conversation. And for the listeners, it's a wrap on this podcast episode. And until next time, keep thriving through. Anthony's journey from corporate executive to authentic consultant really drives home something I see with so many of the consultants I work with. The biggest barriers to building a thriving practice often aren't external. They're the internal stories we tell ourselves, the masks we wear, and the fear based decisions we make when we think we need to be someone other than who we really are. Anthony's insight that we spend most of our time repeating the same 95% of thoughts, many of which don't even belong to us, is a powerful reminder that success in consulting isn't just about having the right strategy or systems. It's about doing the inner work to operate from presence and authenticity. I loved his practical advice about recognizing the physical signs when you're not being authentic. For him, it's the tightness in the shoulders and neck that signaled that he had slipped back into old programming. And his approach to networking and sales conversations, focusing on genuine human connections rather than transactions, is something every client can implement immediately, including me. If you're struggling with imposter syndrome, if you find yourself attracting the wrong clients, or if you're caught in the feast or famine cycle, I encourage you to sit with Anthony's question. What would it be like to shed the plaster and let your golden blue Buddha shine through? You can connect with Anthony on LinkedIn. I'll put the link in the show notes, along with all the resources we mentioned today. And remember, as Anthony said, you don't need to have it all figured out to get started. You just need to show up authentically and trust the process. Until next time, keep thriving through.